What's up everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm building two rustic farmhouse end tables and a matching coffee table, all made out of reclaimed wood. I'll be walking through each step of the build, from removing nails to installing hidden drawers and giving them a two-tone finish based on an idea by Matthew Peach. For the tables, I'm using reclaimed wood that's already got that vintage character and came from a construction site used as a concrete slab frame. First, I removed the old nails using the AP 700 nail remover by Air Locker. I make sure to check every piece of wood thoroughly for nails using a metal detector by Kuman, and I dropped a link in the description for both. Now that the wood's clean, I cut the legs and frame pieces to length on the miter saw. Then I move over to the table saw to rip the pieces down to 3 inches wide for the legs and 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches for the X's and frame lengths. This is going to give me a nice, consistent pieces for both the coffee and end tables. My daughter was in town during filming and volunteered to help me. So since she's a chip off the old block, see what I did there? I gladly accepted. She's drilling all the pocket holes with the Craig K4 pocket hole jig, and I'm outside doing the sanding off camera. The boards get 2 holes at each end on the same side, and the small boards get 2 on each end on different sides. This way they can be hidden during the final assembly of the frame. Now with all the pocket holes drilled and all of the sanding completed, we'll move on to assemble the frame. I'm using wood glue and clamps to secure the pieces in place, making sure everything is square before driving in the pocket screws. I'm using a 2.5 inch pocket screw, and I'm also using Type Bond 3 waterproof wood glue. It doesn't necessarily have to be waterproof, I just like using it, and I pretty much use it on about everything nowadays. It dries pretty fast as well, and it's real easy to work with. So now with the 2 sides complete, we just move on to the 1.5 by 1.5 pieces that connect both sides together. So going around with some wood glue, and again with pocket holes. I have my daughter hold it in place for me so I didn't have to start using the wood clamps. Normally I do all these builds by myself, but it sure was nice having an extra set of hands, and especially it was nice having my child in there with me. She knows her way around the shop pretty good, so having somebody with experience is always a plus when you're doing something that requires 2 people. Unfortunately, she didn't get to stick around until the end of the build, but I hope that she'll come back on future episodes on the channel and help me build something else. So we'll just have to get together and plan out what that is. So look for that in the near future. So now with the frame complete, I moved back to the miter saw with the 1.5s, and I cut my angles for the pieces that will become the X's on each end of the frame. Once I get my angles cut, I set my miter saw depth gauge to about 3/4 inch, and I make a mark on both pieces, and I just cut down just a little back and forth, taking my time until I make them fit correctly. Then I go in and test fit just to make sure I got everything looking correct. Now I move back to the table saw with my leftover 1.5 by 1.5 pieces, and I set it to 3/4 inch on the fence, and I just cut a couple strips. These will be my rails for the bottom shelving. Now on the miter saw, I just cut them to the length that I need, and then I go back to the frame and just test fit to make sure everything looks good. Using a piece of the wood that will be the shelf, of course this is off of PALLETS too, I try to set my depth and get it pretty accurate before doing any mounting. Once I get it where I want it, I put a clamp at each end, and I just go in with a temporary brad nail just to hold them in place until I can come back with a drill and drill some pilot holes and countersink with screws. Doing my pilot holes, I'm using a quick fillet by Craig. This thing comes in pretty handy. I like to use it a lot. It makes you a hole plus a pilot hole, so it always is nice to have one of these on hand as well. I test fit my shelves, and everything looks pretty good. So now I'll just move on to cutting pieces for my drawers. So on the table saw, I just ripped some pieces about 1.5 inches wide, and I want to say this is about 5/8 thick. So it's also reclaimed wood from pallets. So I get out and I just make a square box on the table, and I put wood glue in the ends, and I check square before popping with a brad nail just to hold it in place while I get everything exactly square the way I want it in the bottom mounted. I did go back later and countersink some screws in the frame as well off camera, just to give it a little bit extra hold, because I don't really think after a prolonged use the drawers will stay together without it. So it may be unnecessary, but I put screws in it anyway just in case. So I test fit my bottom, everything looks good. I pop a couple brad nails, I flip it back over, checks, make sure it stays in square. Then I just go around the edges, skipping about every 2 inches or so, putting in some more brad nails. Now the drawer box is complete. I clamp a piece on the top of the frame and then butt up the slides to it. Most people would do this on the bottom, but my slides were left over from another job I did a long time back. So I used what I had, and so therefore I clamped at the top because I didn't want them to touch the tabletop after it was mounted. So moving back and forth, I put the screws in and I mount them to the drawers and I mount it to the frame, and just constantly make sure I keep test fitting. Once I'm happy with it, I just secure the front of it in place with some clamps, and I take my Craig quick flip and drill a couple pilot holes and countersink holes on the inside of the drawer, so I can mount the front bar on and won't have to worry about it ever coming off. So now with the drawers complete, I take out some 2x6s that were reclaimed from another project, and I mark on my table saw just to cut them down to 5 inches wide, making sure to remove any of the leftover factory round over edges or any damage that might be there. But the end goal was just to get down to where all the pieces are 5 inches wide before I glue them together. So now I take the pieces over to a flat surface and I clamp one board down, and then flipping the rest of them on end, I go ahead and put on the glue and I spread the glue. And again, I'm using Titebond 3 per normal for me now, and I just make sure I spread it all out, all even, and just get it put down together, and then taking out as many clamps as I could find or get on there, I just clamp it together, not tight enough to damage it, but tight enough to hold it in place. So while that glue dried, I also went and I painted the frame black, then I painted the frame white. And once all the paint dried, I also had stained the tabletop as well. And then I scuffed up the frame with some 220 grit sandpaper just so you can see that black come through. And I flipped the frame upside down on the tabletop and then just mounted it down straight through the frame. Now I moved over to the coffee table frame. I actually built this frame about a year ago, but I've since then lost the footage. I got real sick for a while, so I just never did finish the video or start the other two. So in the video, I'm scuffing up the paint and just trying to make the black come through just enough to where it gives it that rustic feel. Now using my slide rule, I just measure in just enough to use figure eights. If you're not familiar with figure eights, I'll drop a link to them in the description also. They're pretty cheap, they're real easy to use, they kind of allow the wood to do just a little bit of breathing. And so I use a Forstner bit after marking, and I go around and I start drilling them down just enough to where the figure eight is flush with the top of the frame. So now that they're all drilled out, I just use the screws that came with the figure eights, and I go around and mount each one down. 3 on each end, 4 on the sides, and that's it. Now I'm moving on to mounting the top. I just flip the top upside down on a blanket, and I get it even all the way around. I like to use a slide rule here to make sure I have the same amount hanging off on each side and each end. So I just go around, put in all the screws, I flip the table over, and I insert the bottom shelf pieces the same way I did on the end tables. And that is all. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe on the way out the door, and I'll see you on the next one.